We're live, it seems. It shows on top left.
We are live.
Ah, cool.
What are you doing?
I don't see the stream yet on your on Samad Homes though.
Yeah, just give it a minute or so.
Yeah.
All right, give us a few seconds to get everything set up.
There it is.
And I'll wait for your cue when everybody's sharing.
Mm-hmm.
Houston, we have ignition.
Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Brunch and Purpose. How's everybody doing?
I am doing very well this morning.
You, Brian.
Got my Morpheus T-shirt because today we're going down the rabbit hole to just like in the movie. Everyone on this episode is by default taking the red pill. We're gonna go find out some truth about or some different opinions about investing today.
And while Brian is prepared with his Morpheus t-shirt, I'm prepared with my brunch.
I didn't have brunch today, but I have some water. So
Yeah, I'm ready to absorb a lot of the stuff you want to teach us, Brian. Today's your session, and you're talking about something really interesting. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it before we get started?
Yeah, for sure. So a few weeks ago, we did an episode around this where we were talking about the illusion of financial security. And one of the things that we were talking about was in investing and creating additional sources of income as a way to, be able to get through crises like this and just the different things in your life, reaching goals, that sort of thing. So if you've been following Brunch with Purpose for a while now, you know that I am not necessarily a stock or mutual fund investor. And so the question that I often get from people is, well, if I'm not investing in stocks and mutual fund, then what are the options? What else is there to invest in? And a lot of people don't know that there are other things to invest in. So we're gonna talk a bit about those kinds of things. I know you guys have some questions around that and some comments. So we're gonna get into that. But before we get into some of those details, I just wanted to share a quick story that I think I know Asil, you relate to this. Omar, I think you will as well, and I think a lot of our listeners will. So, about 18 to 20 years ago, I was living in Calgary at the time, and I was working in the corporate world. And this is why I love this movie, The Matrix, so much, because when I saw it, I was like, oh my God, this is my life. I just wasn't happy. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel like, I had a great life, arguably. I had a good job, all those things that you're supposed to get. But I just still had this lingering feeling of dissatisfaction and a low-level depression at getting up, going into work every day, doing the same thing. It was like Groundhog Day over and over again. And that's why I really related with the character in The Matrix, Mr. Anderson, played by Keanu Reeves, because he's got what looks like a pretty good life too, but yet he's got this lingering feeling and he's searching for this guy Morpheus, who is supposed to be able to provide the truth and a different life. Well, when I got introduced to the world of what I'm going to talk about today, these alternative investments, I feel like I met my Morpheus and all of a sudden the world changed for me and I saw things in a completely different way. And then I was able to start operating in the matrix from a place of control and freedom. Again, just like Mr. Anderson, who becomes Neo in the movie The Matrix. So I have now become Morpheus for other people and showing them and, jokingly take the red pill and come down the rabbit hole so that people can see there are alternatives. There is potentially something more for those that have been looking for that, have had that feeling of dissatisfaction. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's why I'm sharing about this stuff. And that's why I continue to pursue it myself. I'd love to hear Omar and Asil. Do you guys relate to that story? Does that resonate for you?
I feel like after an introduction so solid like this, Brian, people are going to go back and watch Matrix for sure.
I should get proceeds. I should be getting like a referral link or something.
I actually watched The Matrix because of how much Brian would talk about it. So in the past, I had started the movie a few times, but never actually finished it because it's not my, like, I'm not into these type of movies, and I was not engaged from the beginning. But then the more Brian talked about it, I'm like, there's something more to it. There's something more to it. I have to push through. So I ended up finishing it not too long ago, and I can see what you're referring to, Brian. I know how you're a big fan of this movie, and I can see it. You know, there's so many things in life today that are sort of almost an extraction of that movie in a way. So
I just wish I was wearing my Neo shirt.
I don't have one.
I'll
We're
tell
all
you,
gonna have to go shopping after COVID-19 and get Matrix t-shirts.
just Amazon. Just go to Amazon and buy one. I do relate to what you're saying. I feel like I've taken the pill multiple times in my life, and my entire understanding grew significantly for it. The it's like a veil that has been that was kind of covering my consciousness or my understanding of the world, and then there you go, we take it off. So it's the same concept as the Matrix, where you go through this reality or non-reality of the feeling of limitlessness. So I know that there will be a pill that we will take at the end of or in the middle of this session. And I know that a lot of people who are listening to us today are going to feel like they're going to want to just go and research stuff. So I'd really recommend that you guys have a notepad, take out a few words that you like really resonate with you, and be willing to learn today, because I really love this session.
But what I love about what Brian shared is that it's your why at the end of the day. It's linked to your ultimate purpose, and I'm really excited to be learning from you today, Brian. So start us.
Thanks, Cecile. So something that Omar just said that I wanted to talk about is that pulling back that veil. So I do remember when I started to get into this back in the early 2000s when I was living in Calgary, and I just like once I found out about this other world and these other types of investments, I wanted to learn more and more and more. So I started going to seminars and meeting with people and reading books and looking at things. And this was largely before social media was super popular and all that, so you actually had to go physically to these things. But I remember my girlfriend at the time, I would share this stuff with her, and she was like, it's like you've pulled back some kind of curtain or some kind of veil, and there's this whole other world out there that people don't know about. And that's exactly how it felt to me, and that's still how it largely feels today. And so that's I want to talk about this, that there are kind of, I'm going to say two, that there's really three. I'll talk about the third one in a bit. But in the world of investing, there's two sort of large or broad categories of types of investments. Now, the first one is the one we're all familiar with, which is public investments. Okay, so we've all heard of publicly traded companies. This is stocks, bonds, mutual funds, this type of thing. Okay, this fits into the realm of public, and all they mean by public is publicly traded companies. You can get access to all their data and all their information, right? When you hear this term of taking a company public, that's so that they can offer their shares to the public through this sort of public investment vehicle. That is by far the one we are the most familiar with. This is the one that banks and financial institutions and advisors are almost always talking about. Well, it turns out that there's this whole other category of investing, which is sometimes referred to as private investing or private equity. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, is some of the things that fall into this realm. Okay, now this could still include potentially having shares in a company, but it's a private company. It is not a company that's publicly traded on any stock exchange anywhere. Okay, but there's a whole bunch of other types of investments that fall into this private world. Now, here's the thing about this. Imagine for a second that you had grown up in Canada or the US, and all you knew about was the US car companies, right? So Ford, GM, Chrysler, right? This type of thing. And then after 20, 30, 40 years of this, You bumped into a guy one day and you're like, hey, what kind of car is this? And he's like, oh, that's my BMW. BMW? Where's that from? Oh, that's from Germany. You mean other countries have cars? Oh yeah, there's Japan, there's Korea, there's Italy, there's Germany, Switzerland, or sorry, Sweden. Lots of countries make cars, but you've never been exposed to this before. You didn't even know that this was a possibility. So here's my question for you. When you're going to those car dealerships and they're not telling you about the other brands of cars and the millions of other possibilities, can you really feel like your best interests are being served by them leaving out this whole other category of possibilities? Because as we know, Japanese cars for quite a while had, way better longevity and gas mileage, right? They were a great, how many people drive Toyotas and Hondas? Germans are known for the amazing German engineering of these high performance cars. Italians with the really high performance cars, right? Maybe one of those types of cars was a better fit for your goals and your needs instead of you trying to fit in with the list of cars that were available from the American manufacturers. And if you go back to like the 70s when the Japanese cars first started to come in, what did people say? You guys might not remember this, but do you recall what the American car companies said about the foreign cars?
No, what did they say? I'm sure it's not something promotional.
You weren't there from the 70s, Asil?
What's that?
You weren't there in the 70s?
I'm dating myself now in this particular call. If my gray hair didn't give it away, it's me talking about the 70s. So the reality was what happened was these cars got bashed, right? The American car companies said, oh, these cars are crap. They're not very good. They're too expensive. They're not reliable. And they said all these things about them. Now, I understand why. They wanted to protect their own interests. They didn't want to lose customers. They wanted to be able to continue with their market share. And that's exactly the reason why you haven't heard of these private investment options, because most banks, most investment companies, and most financial advisors don't offer these products, these investments. Therefore, they can't make fees and commissions on them. Therefore, they take one of two opinions about them. Usually it's they don't even bring them up at all, which is why you've probably never heard of them, or they'll say they're super risky and it's lots of sharks in the water and that, because they don't want to lose that market share either.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have something to add to that actually. As you know, I come from the banking world, and in one of my, I think few years ago, one of my close colleagues switched companies and went to a privately owned brokerage versus, which was a boutique firm versus a bank. And in that brokerage, they offered options of private equity and private lending and private investments and just different types of private investments options. And he said to me, did you know that the wealthiest people in the world, over 50% of their portfolio is in private investments? So how come that these options are just not available in the bank, and rarely do other people know about it anyway? When in reality, if you look at the diversification of the wealthiest people in the world, it's a big chunk of their portfolio. That says something about the credibility of that sector that's usually hidden for most people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And interestingly enough, not only the wealthy, but if you look at banks themselves and what they're investing in, they will have a large percentage of their own, the bank's money, the bank's investments will also be in private investments. So this is the old, I'm telling you to do one thing, and meanwhile, I'm doing something different over here, right? Yeah. What I'm doing with my money is not what I'm directing other people to do. And again, I'm not here to be, all the big bad banks and they're trying to rip people off and all that sort of stuff. It's a business. And you just have to understand that, right? It's buyer beware, like anything else. I mean, going back to the car dealership thing, we've all had that experience. You walk onto the lot and, whatever car you're looking at, the salesperson, oh, I drive that myself, right? They're trying to make a sale, and I get it. I understand it. It's fine, right? It's not good or bad. It just is. Well, it's the same thing in this case. You have to become educated about this. You have to understand this. But you're absolutely right, Asil, and I'm going to give a an example in a minute that is very closely aligned with what you're talking about where this private equity starts to show up. But let's talk for like, well, two things. First of all, there's a third category of investing, which I would say is really, it's just you yourself hands-on. So this is the thing like going out and buying a property, like we talk about with Omar, right? Going out and buying a rental property. So technically that probably fits into the private world, but it's almost like a third category of its own, because nobody is really offering like, hey, come and, you know, work with our company and we're going to help you buy individual properties, unless you're doing joint ventures with another investor like myself or an Omar or a Seal who's doing it on our own. Once we start to formulate that into a company where we're offering that to lots of people, then it kind of fits under that category of private investments. But Omar, tell us some of the other private investments that you're aware of.
Yeah, well, we've dealt with, I mean, like you mentioned, buying a property it can be considered as a private investment. You know, there's many different other ones, like for example, flipping a property, where you can invest your money in a shorter period of time, renovate a property and sell it for a profit. You can flip a rental property where you can go in, increase the rents, and then sell it for a higher profit. You can flip a business where you can purchase an existing business, improve the operations, you know, add a few vision to it, increase the sales, and then sell it for a higher profit. I know that I've personally been involved in places where people who wanted to invest their money could also invest their money in developers. So they would be the investors that aid the development. And you go and you look at the plans, and you look at the vision, and you look at the numbers. And some of these returns are, I mean, phenomenal returns, 15 to 25% in some cases when you kind of cumulative, when you add everything together. You know, they have different structures. They're a little bit complicated, but I've seen people, you know, come out of investments like this with these kind of returns, and it's very common. And yeah, and the list goes on. In the real estate world, I mean, if you're interested and if you're willing to be a little flexible, you will find a lot of opportunities that will come your way.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, if you're sort of just doing this on your own, right? So if I'm going and purchasing a pre-construction condo, or I'm going and purchasing a property and then I'm going to flip it, that's what I consider like this sort of a third category. They technically fall into these private investments, but when it starts to fall into this second sort of private equity category is when there's a company like the brokerage that Asil was talking about. Usually they're a smaller boutique. Sometimes it's only just one person or a few people that are doing this, but they're running it as a company. They have options, and they can put people into these types of investments, just like a bank would put you into stocks or mutual funds or bonds or something like that. That's sort of the private equity world, where somebody is running a company that helps you get into these things. But a lot of these investment options, like Omar is saying, are just available for somebody to do, right? I've purchased pre-construction condos. I've held a second mortgage. So that's another one, is mortgages usually falls under this. I've held one myself where nobody else was involved. There was just a lawyer that set up the mortgage and I held it in my corp. Okay, but then there's also companies that help people get into these types of things. Okay, so that's more of what we're talking about today, is that these things exist. Now, one of the things that you will hear is that these things are risky and there's a lot of sharks in the water. And it's true. Okay, these things are risky when you don't understand them. And if you're going to choose to work with somebody, you have to understand that just like an advisor, a salesperson, the car salesman, whatever, they're looking out for their best interest. And some are operating with more integrity than others. So one of the most important things, and you know, Omar talked about this in the beginning, and Asil regularly mentions this, is about becoming educated and learning and working with people that you know and like and trust, who have experience and have been successful in the area that you want to start to get into. Okay, so yeah, if you just blindly sign up with the first company you hear about that offers this and you lose money, well, like that's not their fault necessarily. Just like if you just blindly buy the first car that somebody offers you and it turns out to be a lemon. If you haven't done any research, if you haven't learned about these people in this company that you're going to work with, it's kind of, you get what you pay for. Have you guys heard about anybody who has gone into these things and done well or not done well?
So when you say these things, are you specifically referring to private, like are you referring to specific investment or just alternative investing in general?
Yeah, alternative investing in general.
I hear a lot of stories that, and I hear conflicting information, just like you're saying. It's because people talk from experience rather than facts. They talk about what happened to them versus what the investment itself actually is. So that's why it's a very emotional space, because people are offering their own opinions based on the consequences that they've been through, and if they're misguided, they're just gonna have this bad taste in their mouth and judge something accordingly. So there's lots of articles I read and lots of conflicting information out there, which is why I find it very confusing to know what to rely on, to know where to get this information from, what companies do you learn, what professionals do you follow. So I totally get why the space is very congested with all sorts of opinions, and that's what makes it particularly harder for the average Joe to even know where to start from. So I can sympathize with that for sure.
Absolutely, Asil, you're right. And that's, I think, why so many people are more drawn towards the public types of investments, because you can just go down to your bank, and a lot of people, still have this idea of like, oh, well, my bank equals safety, and the people working at the bank know more than I do. And if I'm signing up for these things, then somebody else must have checked this. Okay. And I would compare that to like the food industry, right? So, is there a regulatory body that's supposedly paying attention to all of the food that we're supposed to be eating? Yes. And are they routinely catching all of the bad food that's out there? No. And then you see all these stories nowadays about like, oh, it wasn't fat, it was sugar. Yet we've been promoted sugar products for 50 years that aren't necessarily healthy for us, sugary drinks, pop and sodas and things like that. So it's kind of in the same thing. And that's what I hear oftentimes with people in like when it comes to diet and what to eat, is they're very confused. There's conflicting information. This is just a reality of life, right? This is the way that these things are. You need to do research. You need to learn about these things, just like you need to learn about what you should be putting into your body, and learning to read labels and being able to decipher one thing from another. You have to be able to do the same thing with investments. But here's the interesting, oh, go ahead, Asil.
I said what comes to my mind about that is, while the information is there's an information overload and some of it is conflicting, which leads for it to be confusing. But similarly to the food, since it's a really great analogy to use, yes, the information we read may in fact be true, but it may not apply to our body. So we have a very customized, everybody is different, and therefore not every diet out there is going to work for everybody. And I think the same thing goes for investments. So you can read and educate yourself on to have a foundational knowledge, but ultimately a catered advice based on your situation, not just currently, but also your future dreams, your aspirations, your lifestyle goals. There's a lot to take into consideration, similar to when I used to do financial plans for people. It's not a one size fit all. So it's not enough for me to educate you on what's out there and how investments work. It's more important to align these options to your personal life and aspirations.
You're absolutely right, Asil. I 100% agree with you. And it's actually why with my clients, the first place that I start with them is, what are your goals? What is it you're trying to achieve? I get these questions all the time. Brian, should I invest in real estate? Brian, what about ETFs? Brian, should I get into cryptocurrencies? And my answer is always the same. How do I know? I don't know what you're trying to accomplish. I don't know what your goals are. I don't know if you're wanting to retire in 2 years or 20 years. So how can I just blankly tell you, you should be investing in this? But that's another one of the problems that I find with a lot of the processes that are going on with these investment companies. I was just having this chat with one of my clients yesterday, and he's like, I was talking to this person and they were saying, oh, ETFs are the way to go. I said, did they ask you any questions about you? No. Did they understand what your plan for retirement is? This guy is in his 60s. This is something that, he's going to need cash flow, and he's going to want to start to produce cash flow very soon. Did they understand the deficiency between you and your wife's pension and what your expenses are going to be? No. So they're just blanketly telling you ETFs are the way to go without knowing anything about you. And again, that's like saying you should buy a Toyota Tundra, and I don't even know, do you have a family? Do you need a truck? What's going on here, right? And that's another one of the issues that I have around this world.
Very, very true, Brian. I mean, we do, half of our business is geared towards investments and creating a long-term vision for clients. And it all starts with, why are you doing this? And what is it that you want from it? And back to previous times when we've spoken about the purpose of your investment will, very, very clearly create a distinction of which investment is right for you. You asked before, I mean, if we've seen people who have succeeded in these different types of investments. Yes, we have. I've personally been involved in many people's journeys that have taken that approach, whether they got into started a MIC, and they started to invest in different developments, or lend hard money for construction, or lend hard money for acquisitions. And again, the returns are great. You're talking about 5, 6, up to 12, 13% returns on these investments. People don't know what this is, and it's very easy. Go Google a MIC and see what you can learn from it, and then find the right person to ask more questions about it. But yeah, there's a ton of people that have dared to ask themselves, what is an alternative? Let's follow a different path here. Let's not go the same route. And talking to the thing that you said, Cecile, that there's a little bit of skepticism towards it. I mean, me and you have been working on a program together, and we've talked about psychological biases that exist. And it flares up in my mind right away when I start thinking,
Familiarity.
Yeah, there's a lot of fun, biases. People fall into pitfalls on a regular basis because it's just easier. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the bias of familiarity?
Sure. The familiarity bias is basically based on the observation that people would overlook a potential opportunity to invest in simply because it's unfamiliar to them. And it has less to do with the technical or fundamental analysis of the opportunity, and more to do with the fact that it's just unfamiliar. So we dislike options that are unfamiliar to us, irrelevant of the potential they have, similar to our resistance to change in a way. Like anything that change and anything that's unknown brings a host of emotions that we tend to shy away from. And actually, in a recent research I was reading about, now this has less to do with familiarity and more to do with change, but they're more or less on the same wavelength. And for every change that people need to do, they need 4 pros to counter 1 con to justify doing something in that route, because otherwise they would resolve back to the status quo. So I feel like this is very interesting, because when we're introducing something new to people, they're going to have different resistance towards these new ideas or new alternatives. And for every 1 resistance, we need to offer 4 promotional, persuasive arguments to justify this new way of thinking.
That is another reason why, it wasn't only the car manufacturers that were bashing the people when the Japanese cars came into the market. It was also these poor people who were, falling the same pitfall, the familiarity bias pitfall, being afraid of change, and just, sticking to what they know, because no, we don't want to take a challenge. We don't want to take a risk. Even though, at that time, it could have been a lot cheaper to get into a Japanese car than it was for the American cars.
You guys are absolutely bang on, and I love this part of it. And you're absolutely right. And I believe that actually the banks and the investment companies, they're leveraging that, right? What do you see now with the commercials and the advertisements? Oh, just log on and answer 3 simple questions, and we'll take care of everything for you. They're preying on that idea of, we know you don't want to do change. We know you don't want any extra work. We know you don't want to have to learn anything. We'll take care of it for you. Well, the metaphor that I use in this case is, can you imagine having a baby and then driving that baby up to the local daycare and handing the baby over and going, okay, I sure hope you do a good job with him. I'll be back in 30 years to collect him, right? We think that's a ridiculous example. Nobody would do that with their child, but that's exactly what people do with their investments, right? They drive to the neighborhood bank, they hand it over, they don't ask any questions, and they say, okay, I hope in 30 years I'm able to retire, and
Wow.
that's it.
What a crazy analogy. I'm gonna borrow that.
Absolutely, borrow it. Okay, so I promised to talk in detail about some of this stuff. The three of us can get off on concepts very quickly, and I love these discussions. But I'm going to offer one of those 4 counters that you were talking about, Asil. So we already had one where you mentioned like the wealthy have at least 50% of their portfolio in these private investments. So hello, there's a hint. If you'd like to become more wealthy, perhaps you want to follow what the wealthy are doing, not what the herd is doing, who are, fighting and battling and never seeming to get ahead. So here's another example I want to share with you. So pretty much everybody, hopefully everyone in this call is familiar with these great big pension funds, right? There's the teachers' pension fund, the nurses' pension funds, doctors, like truck drivers and things like that, where they will have these gigantic pension funds that will take care of a whole industry's pensions, either in Canada or the US or even, amongst countries. We're talking about oftentimes hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And these things are being managed by very big brain, smart people who understand finances and investing and this sort of thing. Okay. And by the way, you can Google all this information. This is public information. I'm not making this up. So if you go back about 15 to 20 years ago, and you were to look at these pension funds and what the money was being invested in, and keep in mind with these pension funds, these are almost like promises to these workers that, 30 years from now or 20 years from now, when you retire, this is what your pension is going to be. So there's a lot of pressure here, right? In order to make this money grow and to have this money in the future so that these people can actually retire and get what they're being promised. Okay, so it's not just willy-nilly the way that they're doing this. So if you look back 15 to 20 years ago, you'll see that the percentage of where these funds are being allocated was around 12 to 15% was in the world of private investments, and about 85% was in the more public investments, stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. However, if you investigate that today and look at these great big public funds that you can find out about, like the teachers and the nurses and that sort of thing, you actually find that the numbers are now closer, interesting with what Asil said about wealthy people, to more of a 50-50 split. It might be like 52 or 53 in the public and 47 or 48 in the private investments. So over the past 15 to 20 years, yeah,
that's insane.
Exactly. You're talking about a 300% increase in money into these private investments and being taken out of the public investments. Okay, by these gigantic pension funds that are looking to make money for their, for the retirement of their workers in the future. Okay, so then and this is over the span of about the last 15 to 20 years that this switch has been happening. Then they asked the folks managing these pension funds, why were you moving away from the public investments and to a much richer percentage of these private investments? And this is what kills me. The answer was the private investments over time, on average, offer higher returns with less volatility than the public investments. So basically, more reward, less risk. But what is the narrative that is being taught to us in the media about the public investments? That they are
more risky.
This 5%, 6%, 7% is a wonderful return, and these other investments are more risky. Okay, so if the wealthy are doing it, and if these gigantic pension funds are increasing their portfolio into private investments, could be something that you want to start to investigate.
100%. Wow, that's very fascinating. That growth in that kind of period. I mean, just reminded me when you said, the more reward and less risky, reminded me of this concept that really changed the way that I saw investments. And it's a concept that I learned called asymmetric investments. And what does that mean? It means, risking a little to make a lot. That's the concept. I mean, risking 1 cent to make $1 versus risking $1 to make 1 cent. I don't know if that makes sense. Trying to simplify it as much as I can. And there's, go on, Brian. You're shaking your head.
Oh no, I'm shaking my head because I'm like, you're absolutely right. And this is the thing that, going back to the private investments, and oftentimes they're being labeled as risky. So I know, because obviously the business that I'm in, I'm talking to a lot of people about this, but I hear so many stories of people that are like, oh, I did one of those private investments and I lost my money. I'll never do that again. Or I bought one rental property and had a horrible experience. I'll never do that again. But somehow it's okay to remain in the public investments when every 10 to 12 years we lose 30 to 50% of our portfolio. Why are people not having that same sort of knee-jerk reaction of, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to start to look for alternatives that in the private world, they'll do it once, they'll have a bad experience, and then they'll never do it again, right? So yeah, Asil?
There's a bias called the representative heuristic bias, and that's based on the we misunderstand the close. So if two things remotely appear close to each other, we tend to in our head increase the correlation of the likelihood of an event repeating itself. So just if something is remotely similar, we feel as if the results of one would be the same of whatever happened in the past, and that's why the past repeats itself in a way from how people perceive it. And this is actually the way it impacts our decisions in investments are both in the negative and positive side. So if something was positive and to our advantage in the past, we may want to repeat it for something that has nothing to do with an investment being presented to ourselves again. But just because it looks like it's similar, we may be in favor of it, and vice versa. So a lot of people, for example, lost money in the 2008 stock market and never want to do stocks ever again. But that's because they were probably either not in the right risk tolerance they were supposed to be in, or it was never explained to them properly, or they were just being misled, or whatever the case may be. But those who had proper structured, diversified portfolios and proper guidance along the way wouldn't claim the losses when they happen. And therefore, even though they experience the turbulences like everyone else does, they don't necessarily claim the losses and hurt themselves in the process.
Yeah, and again, we're not saying 100%, right? In either case, we're saying the wealthy, it's around 50%. In these pension funds, it's around 50%. I personally don't invest in stocks and mutual funds anymore because this is what I do all the time, right? So I'm always in these private investments. This is what I'm looking at and working in, on a daily basis. I've trained myself over the last 16 years. I've worked with mentors, and I'm not expecting the average person to do all of that. But what we're trying to get out of this talk is just to start considering that, hey, maybe this is something that I need to be looking into. Maybe I need to go from 0% or 5% to more, right? Actual true diversification by having different types of investments. Because as I've said before, having different mutual funds is not diversification if the entire stock market goes down, like we just saw it do recently, right? All of those mutual funds, I don't care how many you have, it's not diversification if it's all in the same thing. Omar, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think what I'm listening and understanding from you, Brian, is that, asymmetric investments, the concept of risking or risking a little to make a lot, exists in all spaces. It exists in the public and it exists in the private as well. But what you're trying to say, Brian, is, and I've seen it a lot of times, I've seen it in both spaces. I've seen it in real estate. I've seen a lot of people that have made a lot of money by risking a little bit. But what you're trying to say, Brian, is in this private space, there's a lot less people looking in it because of this fear that people kind of bring out. And there's a lot of risk here, and there may be a lot of risk. There may be a lot of risk in some investments, but there's probably a lot more asymmetric investments that you can take advantage of if you know the formula to assess things properly, right? What I usually tell my clients is they follow 4 rules, right? Or that's the principle that I follow myself. First, I ask myself is, what are the odds of me losing the money in this? I assess the odds of me losing that money. And then the second thing I ask myself is, what is the risk? What is the, what is the chance of this being an asymmetric reward to my investment, right? I would try to assess the upside in the investment. And then the third thing is I want to understand the tax strategy that I need to follow with this investment. And then finally, how can I diversify what I already invest my money into? What piece of my pool do I want to put towards this investment? And these are the 4 steps that I follow that have, thankfully they've been very positive for me personally, and that's what I teach my clients as well.
So just by the fact that you have a process, and even a 4-step process and 4 questions that you ask yourself, means that you're ahead of probably 90% of the folks out there that are so-called investing, and they're not. They're really just handing their money over to someone else and praying, right? They're not an investor, they're a prayer, okay? So that's exactly one, a lot of the next question I usually get after people ask, well, what else can I invest in, is, well, how do I learn about this stuff? Where can I learn about this? And the answer is there's not a lot of places that you can learn about this. You want to learn to be a stock investor? My goodness, you go to Chapters or Indigo and there's a whole section on how to become a stock investor. But you want to learn how to invest in private mortgages or hard money lending? There's no books, or maybe one you might find about stuff like this. How did I learn? As I said, I went to 1,000 seminars and teamed up with people and learned through some mistakes, lots of successes, and slowly built this. But that's exactly why I opened up my coaching business, and why my coaching is around educating and empowering people and teaching them about these types of things, and then teaching them a due diligence process, right? You have yours, Omar, it's worked for you. I have one that I teach to people just so they have any kind of due diligence process. Because nowadays I go to these presentations and nobody asks any questions. Nobody knows. Maybe the next time it's my turn, I might talk about the whole risk reward idea, because people have a funny idea of risk and what risk actually is and reward. And here's the short answer. There are actually things that you can do to protect your investment, protect your capital, protect your ROI, and protect your exit strategy. But you're not going to hear about this in your bank or in any stock buying course. And that's where, and so that's why I think, Omar, you're going to like this, because this idea of, well, I need to only risk a little bit. Well, what if you could protect that risk? What if you could protect the money that you are investing? Now you can start to put more in, knowing that you can actually protect it. And the reason I don't invest in the stock market is because, for the most part, these protection strategies don't exist. So I look for investments with higher returns where I can implement these protection strategies, thereby lowering my risk, but still enjoying larger and larger reward. That's when it starts to become exciting, and when you really start to get into what it means to be an investor. And that's what the wealthy are doing. Okay, so I did want to list a few of the types of investments that I myself have participated in that fit in that sort of private equity or private investment. So some examples are Reits. That stands for Real Estate Investment Trusts. Okay, so that's where you hear about like these large commercial companies who own an entire plaza, and you can buy shares in that company and be an owner in that commercial real estate plaza. That's an example of a REIT. So now, just like you own shares in an oil and gas company, you can own shares in a real estate company. That's what a sort of a REIT is in that one. You talked about MIX, so that stands for a Mortgage Investment Corporation. So basically, there's lots of things out there where you can invest into a pool or a fund, which is basically, rather than me going out and doing an investment in one property, I join up with a team of people. We put our money into a pool, and then that pool is used to invest in lots of properties or lots of mortgages or lots of hard money lending. It's the sort of the wildebeest theory, right? If I have a herd of wildebeest, there's a less of a chance of me getting eaten by the lion if I'm in a giant herd than if I'm wandering around on my own. Okay, I'm spreading out my risk amongst lots of projects and lots of people. And some of those, like, you can invest in those with $5,000 or $10,000 just to learn about it and to find out about it. You don't have to be putting in, 100 or 500,000 or that sort of thing. A MIC is a kind of pool or fund that is actually registered and then is eligible for RRSP and TFSA funds. Okay, it's a much longer description. This is exactly the kind of thing that I teach to people.
It's a great tax strategy, Brian.
It can be an amazing tax strategy. If you're using TFSA money, which grows tax-free, and you're making 12, 13, 14, 15% per year, and that's growing tax-free, hello, that's a heck of a lot better than 4 or 5%, right? But people don't find out about these things, okay? Then you start to talk about things like companies that are doing rent to own, lease to own with properties or flips, or you talked about construction and development. A lot of times these pools and funds, these will be the back end investments that is making the money for this pool, right? Syndicated mortgages, group ownership, cryptocurrencies. That's something did not have that on my radar at all. And then 2 years ago, I had a client who started to explain some of this to me. And when I saw that this is the future, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when cryptocurrencies become the future of money. And you know, maybe I can talk about that on a separate one. Shares in private corporations, you talked about that as well. So I can literally buy into a private corp that is doing some of these types of projects. That has tax advantages as well, just like if I'm buying into a share of Tesla or Ford or whatever, and I don't have any tax implications until I sell my shares. So, you know, and then I can slice and dice all of those things that I just mentioned into lots of different ways as well. It's overwhelming on the one hand, because people are like, oh my God, how do I learn about this? But it's also opportunity. Okay. And when you can, as you said, double-digit returns. I mean, people think I'm lying, but I have averaged 20 to 25% returns over the past decade, right? While protecting my downside and lowering my risk. And people think this is, you know, somehow magic or fantasy. It's not. Okay. And again, I have devoted myself to learning this, and then my business is teaching other people about, you know, how does this, what's the good, what's the bad, what's the ugly, how do you assess these things, how do you get into it, where are some of the opportunities out there? And they are everywhere.
Yeah, and I think we've you know, just listening to everything you're saying, we've many times talked about the purpose, the why do you need to invest, which, you know, when you start to really get deep into, you start to realize what it is you need. So you start to understand your what. And then once you know what is your what is the vehicle? I mean, Brian has talked about some phenomenal vehicles here. And once you know the what, and then you start to go deeper into that, you start to understand the how, right? And Brian was talking about educating yourself with the concepts and principles that he's talking about. First of all, you know, as I mentioned at the beginning of this session today, is that write down some terms that you've heard Brian talk about and that you're curious about, and then start to, you know, when you really want to know about something, a lot of ways will open up. You'll start to realize the how. You'll start to realize where you can maybe you can research it online. Maybe you can find that one book or a couple of books that talk about that concept. Maybe you can buy an audio book and invest $20 into it, right? But if you really want to catalyze that process, if you really want to speed up that process, then find the right person that is eager to share their experiences, somebody who's had the success that, you know, that you know, they're now ready to start shaping other people's lives and they're excited about it. Go to these people and you can catalyze that experience a lot faster and be able to avoid a couple of the pitfalls that Asil was talking about, that most of the people psychologically without any control they fall into. And I know I'm a big advocate of education, Brian. I believe that education and is you know, people invest in anything, but before you invest in anything, you need to invest in yourself. You need to invest in yourself, right? And you know, a $200 course that you can sign up for, $2,000. I've personally paid over $20,000 in a year educating myself in courses outside, you know, and going, following the best of the best, the people who have made it, the people who are really have a rare offering that they are sure of, and learned so much and was able to reap rewards far beyond. I've been in places and points of time where I was really desperate and going through these many of my friends call them adventures, right? I've been able to double my business. I've been able to grow my business twofolds because of an investment that I've put. And the beauty about it is we've talked about like how it just constantly continues to get bigger, right? Over time, whatever you learn is constantly going to grow asymmetrically as well. And that's a perfect asymmetric investment. What you're spending on education, the risk of what you may lose with that is much smaller than the gain that you're going to be making in the.
I have the perfect story for that actually. So if you take a penny and you double it over the next 30 days, how much money you think you're gonna have at the end of the day? And I know I asked you that question before, Omar. I know it's not a new question for you, but it really drives this concept home. So after 30 days, I've asked this question before, and some people would give me like few $1,000s or whatever, but a penny doubled over 30 days would be over 5.3 million by the end of the 30 days. And this goes to show you that the effort you put at the beginning might be a lot and the reward is little. A penny becomes 2 pennies, 2 pennies become 4. But then towards the end of the journey, your growth is exponential. So at the beginning, it's a lot of hard work, but there's a turning point where your effort is still the same, but the reward is just massively different.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the thing I want to give, the message to the people listening here today. One of the things that I got from one of my early books that I read, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, was stop taking advice from people who are no further ahead than you are, and start taking advice from people who have achieved what you want to achieve. There's a famous saying that when the student is ready, the master will appear. It doesn't have to be tons of hard work on your part. And a lot of times when I get clients and they're used to this idea of like, oh, well, I can just go to my bank and I don't have to pay anything and they'll just do my investments for me. Why should I pay you for coaching? And it's like, well, are you getting educated over there? Are you learning anything? Are you working with people who have achieved the goals that you want to achieve? What would it look like if you paid me to give you value and to educate you rather than pay me to put you into some investment which might not even be a good fit for you, but that's the only way I'm going to get paid? And then you can use that information over and over and over again. If you spend $2,000 or $3,000 or even $5,000, and this is something I say to people now, if you had asked me 15 years ago, Brian, would you pay $5,000 to save $50,000 on an investment that's going to go wrong? I would have said, hell yeah, I'll sign up for that all day long. Why would I want to lose 50 if I can pay 5? And then I can repeat that over and over and over and over again. I had a lady one time go, that coaching, that's the amount that my lawyer charges me. I'm like, great, what have you learned from your lawyer? You have to go to your lawyer every single time you want to do the same transaction over and over again. You never learn to do the transaction yourself. Yet when you have a mentor, when you have somebody who knows what they're doing and has done it and can teach it to you, then you can go and turn those pennies into dollars without having to do all the hard work. Learn from my successes and mistakes, or from Omar's or Seal's or somebody else in your life, rather than learning from your own mistakes. All the do-it-yourselfers out there, great. I was a do-it-yourselfer and I spent a lot of money making mistakes and learning the hard way, and then I got mentors and things started to change. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that everybody out there wants to help you, and it doesn't mean that there aren't any sharks in the water. And another thing that I go through with people is, how do you assess the people that you're going to work with? How do you find the right partner, the right mentor, the right educator? Because that's just as important, right?
Some people are giving you wrong information just because it's a bias, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I have biases as well. But again, if you're paying me for coaching, I'm being objective. I'm not trying to drive you to a particular thing, which is invest with me. I am literally objectively giving you information. I don't care what you invest in, because that's not how I'm getting paid. You're paying me to educate you, just like if you're going to school or class or taking a program or whatever. That's what the value becomes, is that education. And who doesn't talk about education as being something valuable, right? The wealthy people for generations have understood that when they educate the next generation, they will create more wealth and sustain the wealth that has already been there. That's what people really need to get from this. It's time to educate yourself and not just take what's being told to you at face value.
And education is a compounded investment as well. You know, every year that you will, after retrieving that knowledge, your knowledge will grow even more, and your your profits will grow even more. And you talked about something that's really cool as well, where the bias. Why are people not knowing this information? Because you have some financial planners that are guiding you to investments that pay them commissions, right? And I remember learning about this term called a fiduciary, and it's a financial planner that they deal with the bias because they have an agreement that's they don't get paid proportionately. That person who's giving you advice doesn't get paid proportionately to the investment. They get paid a flat sum from you that has nothing to do with the investment.
It actually goes even deeper than that. So fiduciary is about a responsibility. Okay, so 99% of the advisors out there have no fiduciary responsibility to the best interests of the client. Okay, and I've shared this before, the word advisor, have you ever wondered why it's spelled OR? The word advisor is spelled ER because that is an alternative spelling, but the financial industry realized that using that spelling removed all responsibility of what is the client's best interest. Okay, so those companies are working from their own best interest. What's best for the company? They changed the name of the spelling of the word, and you can look this up, so that they don't have any responsibility for the best interest of the client. You think about like a doctor or a lawyer, right? The doctor has the Hippocratic Oath. A lawyer has the client attorney privilege. There's a responsibility where they do no harm. They have to be operating in the client's best interest. That's what a financial fiduciary is about. An advisor with a fiduciary actually has a responsibility to you. It does not exist in 99%. It's just starting to move into Canada. There are a lot more advisors that have a fiduciary responsibility in the US. It's just starting to gain popularity in Canada.
I know that there's a lot of restructuring happening to that industry because the regulatory body is stepping in. Like in the past, anybody could have called themselves a financial planner. Now there's a movement where you need to have your PFP or CFP to even qualify to have that financial planning title, along with what these educational requirements are. So there is a move in the right direction. I'm just surprised that it's happening now and it's not part of the initiation of these particular industries. And we just lost Omar, by the way.
Yes, I know. I became the host somewhere along there. I got so excited that Omar had to go splash some cold water on his face.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk. This topic I know can go on for days, and I know that we're doing these episodes weekly anyway, because every week we want to uncover it from a new different angle. So
and again, right, like this isn't about making one group wrong and another group right. This is it's just buyer beware. You need to educate yourself. When you start to take responsibility, when I start to take responsibility for my financial future, for my financial health. I feel this way about the medical industry. I'm not going to put my health in the hands of a doctor. My health is my responsibility. I feel this way about the food that I put into my body, about my exercise, about my finances, about my work. It's about this responsibility. If you're going to blindly, without asking any questions, hand over your responsibility to someone else, then it's going to make sense that they are going to be considering their best interest. That's the way the world works, like it or not. Yes, there are still millions of advisors out there that want to help their clients and are acting with integrity and are trying to meet their clients' best interest. That's not what I'm saying here. But the industry is not set up that way. And at the end of the day, it's still your responsibility. Just like you shouldn't blindly trust that if there's a sugary cereal or you know, these energy drinks, that's going to be healthy for you. I remember hearing about a woman that was suing Nutella because it wasn't a healthy breakfast, right? That this was on the label and she'd been feeding her kids this for 10 years for breakfast every morning. And it's like, really? You needed someone to tell you that Nutella probably wasn't a healthy breakfast? Like, come on, when are you going to take responsibility for your health, for your future? And it's no different with finances. So I'm not here to vilify or demonize anyone. I just want people to understand it's your responsibility to learn these things and have your best interest in mind.
We're here to educate, share some knowledge, inspire, and motivate. This is ultimately what I see our role is. We're educators, guidance systems in a society that feels very lost. And we'll end it here. So I'm not sure how to stop the live because it started.
Yeah. I think I'm looking at it. Stop live stream. Okay. So thanks everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend and start to June, and we'll see you next Saturday. Thanks for tuning in.